NATO, as the most established collective security coverage, is a source of stability in the transatlantic region by its deterrence and combat readiness. The semi-academic meetings usually witness the circulation of narratives like resilience or resolute commitment to the goals of alliance with a repetition of the same things. Given NATO's mood of unity with its allied security architecture, NATO pursues a method of preparing itself for a defense mission within the frame of Washington Treaty. In this sense, an overall capacity of NATO exists to coordinate the members and organic assets of the alliance, being prepared for crisis response in case of the worst-case scenario options. For the complexity of the lengthy and grueling process, the strategic concept of the alliance, and approved by the heads of the states or governments, and by the consent of all, drives the efforts of micro, meso, and macro security architectures in NATO. In this context, the concept shapes the mission prioritization and budgeting of the alliance with a precise focus on the perceived risks and threats. Nevertheless, it's not an easygoing process to draft and abstract it, since it may be a years-long effort, at least to come to a shared or least terms of understanding. Each member state attempts to inject its own priorities to impose a recognition of specific threat types of themselves. And that's why the latest concept was approved in 2010 after a very long term of discussions. It may be speculated that the Russian aggression in Ukraine has manufactured the new concept this year, but this concept is an output of a long preparatory and persuasion process that Russia challenge contributed to fastening the approval procedure and also maybe transforming or maybe identifying the scope of the concept in a more appropriate condition. Well, the concept itself is a referring point to design the goals of strategic and operational undertakings of NATO that affect the collective intentions of the heads of states. And meanwhile, NATO's strategic leadership and operational commands observe the identified political and military goals delineated in it. Actually, concept defines the security environment that NATO could face. This depiction supports the processes of contingency planning, force disposition and structure, and peacetime but combat-oriented operational activities like intelligence, strategic communications, etc. Constituting features of the security environment is a matter of competition among the member states on the other hand, because they all want to include their threat perceptions as if the overall alliance has to deal with it. On the other hand, the alliance tends to predict threats and makes strategic assessments to pinpoint the expected challenges and long-term trends or patterns. In this sense, actors and patterns are to be clarified specifically as part of all these expectations. And concept lays stress on the principles to be observed by the alliance as a constraint of the hierarchy. In this context, the concept puts forward the basics of the modus operandi at a very strategic level. For instance, energy security may be a priority for the alliance that could facilitate relevant tasks for the military commands and by the contribution of the allotted forces by the member states. It then justifies such a military mission as a previously agreed operation type by referencing the intention to the already agreed concept. Hence, it fastens the decision-making process of the leaders once previously agreed threat types, security environment, or guiding principles require collective action. In this sense, the motto of the strategic concept 2010, the previous one, is active engagement and modern defense, and emphasizes a resonating posture of military mobility with enhanced capabilities of the NATO forces. A change for the new of them had become the primary motivation of the concept of 2010. And the text clearly underlines the previous one. The political goals of the alliance within the frame of untouchable words such as freedom, integrity, independence, or security, as mentioned in the Washington Treaty. And I don't think that it will change in the new one. And it just reminded the words reform, modernization, and transformation in the agenda of the alliance. The core tasks of the concept 2010 was collective defense, crisis management, and cooperative security in accordance with the security environment of them. It actually depicted the pillars of engaging the foreseen security threats in 2010s. Nevertheless, the concept coincided with the varying conflicts and societal upheavals of the era, such as the Arab Spring of 2011, NATO's inclusion in Afghanistan and Iraq, emerging conflict types such as proxies and hybrids of the 2010s. In this sense, the security conceptualization of 2010 reflects what had been experienced in 2000s, mainly after 9/11 and concurrent escalations, but was short of envisaging the developments after the Arab Spring. The threat assessment for a conventional attack against NATO's territory was assessed as low in this concept. On the other hand, conventional concerns of the new members of the alliance at the Eastern Front were resonating by a potential Russian threat then. In this scope, Russia was counted as the country should be managed in mutual relations based on NATO-Russia Founding Act and Rome Declaration. China, on the other hand, was not a point of concern in 2010. And if you just categorize the security conceptualization of 2010, well, it was first security concerns identified as ballistic missiles, watching Russia, the proliferation of nuclear weapons, terrorism and extremism, etc., including cyber attacks. And later then, it clarified how to defend and deter all these threat types with a long list of how to engage them, and with a transitional modus operandi in the form of crisis management. But the methodology of this concept was security through cooperation. Well, NATO 2030, which was prepared by the coordination of NATO General Secretary Jens Stoltenberg, well, it was a new input. He formed a 10-person reflection group to look at NATO's current and future role and suggested recommendations on how to reinforce alliance unity, political consultation between allies, and NATO's political role. It was to expand the security perception of NATO prior to designing a new security concept after 2010. In this sense, the product of the expert group signaled how NATO could be transformed to promote its readiness for the emerging trends until 2030. The policy recommendation pointed out Russia and China as the challenging state actors of the new era due to Russia's military capacities and China's very different kind of challenge, respectively. The policy brief lists the commonly accepted security risks of them, and it was irrelevant to the literature, while analyzing them with the realities of the potential disputes among the allies. In this sense, the policy brief is more focused on to count two competitors like the ones that should be co-opted, but also competed in accordance with the need of international politics. Furthermore, functional and sectoral concerns of the experienced era inspired the experts to underline the themes of security situations. Well, what are these themes? This is another question. NATO 2030 policy brief defines, for instance, systemic rivalry, geopolitical competition, political environment with disputes between the allies. Emerging threats for a new strategic concept means Russia, China, emerging disruptive trends, terrorism, the South, arms control, energy security, climate, human security, pandemics, hybrid, cyber threats, and space other than strategic communication. And in this sense, the new strategic concept to be discussed, well, it reflects the indicators of the new strategic environment. And actually, it was in the words of Secretary General Stoltenberg in a virtual event on June 4th of 2021. It was organized by German Council on Foreign Relations and the Brookings Institution. Stoltenberg repeats the policy brief prepared by the group of experts through NATO 2030 with the same motto, but complemented by the narrative at transatlantic agenda for future. Stoltenberg counts NATO as the political and military alliance, adding diplomacy as the third dimension of NATO's response to threats. Russia and China remains the actors of concern, though the geography in interest has been claimed wider than the traditional transatlantic coverage. Stoltenberg's main highlights are worth listing to see the aims of alliance under 9 categories. They are first, strengthening NATO as the unique and indispensable forum of transatlantic consultations. The emphasis in here is consultation. And boosting collective defense against all threats. That means counting all sorts of threats as the focus. Developing resilience objectives to see the new frontiers, boost transatlantic innovation. Upholding rules-based international order. and that's political, stepping up training and capacity building support for partners, and climate change, well, developing a strategic concept, especially for the changing security environment, and investing more and better in terms of funding and capacity building. Well, this speech indicates a more flexible, adaptable NATO posture to respond not only to intangible threats, but mainly the ones circulated after the Cold War, but to more complex and contested ones. The unpredictability of the threats apparently pushes NATO to expand the area of geographical coverage and preparedness for shapeless threats. In this sense, Russia's aggression in Ukraine reminded the reemergence of conventional warfare with a potential usage of weapons of mass destruction. China's economic domination, mainly designating the supply-demand chain, does have the potential to escalate the financial markets prior to vital realization of Chinese interests through the military. On the other hand, the means that both state and non-state actors, including terror networks, we don't want to justify their existence by calling them as non-state actors, may exploit the environment where the emerging conflict types may suddenly erupt, and these are the parameters to be observed. In this context, NATO considers both state and non-state actors and terror networks as potential actors other than newly emerging entities like proxies and private military companies in a hybrid, irregular, and asymmetric environment. All in all, the changing actor of any sort does have the opportunity to defeat the powerful by small asymmetric wars by benefiting from the most favorable environment and assets. In this sense, NATO's defense understanding needs to be shapeless and multidimensional to secure the alliance. The course of the preceding concepts and agendas of the NATO summits indicate the efforts of complying with the prerequisites of the experienced era. On the other hand, it's apparent that strategic concept, which clarifies the priorities and general direction of the force structure, cannot be adopted to the emerging threat types in transforming security environments. It has been 20 years to change the strategic concept of 2010 after a lengthy persuasion process of NATO's bureaucracy to push a new concept through NATO 2030 agenda. Well, the new concept is not publicized yet, but the context should be expected per the words of General Secretary Stoltenberg, underlined by the shared aims of the alliance. Thank you so much for your patience.